This idea of different branches of government actually started back around 200 BC with a Greek philosopher named Polybius. And there was a lot of debate at the time about which form of government was best. And some people would look at monarchy and say, this is the best one because it has the strength to administer the government, especially in war. And in an area where wars were common, man, that is important. You've got to have a decisive leader that can make calls quickly, do what they need to do, conscript people into the army, and protect our borders. So a lot of people voted for that one. Monarchy is the best. But the problem with it was that it tended toward tyranny. Someone gets too much power and they start to abuse it. Others espoused aristocracy as the best form of government. And an aristocracy was meant to represent the interests of the wealthy and those who controlled the majority of the resources of a nation. But aristocracy tended to devolve into something called oligarchy, which is oppressive government by a few rich families. And everyone else just kind of gets to be the serfs and gets to serve those few rich families. And others still, and this is one that Greece practiced with or experimented with, was democracy, because this represented the masses. This is the one that represented the vast majority of the people. So that's the one that was the best. But inevitably, in every single time a democracy is tried, it turns into mob rule and just a violent, terrible end. So each of these types of government has some real positives, but have some major downsides. And Polybius was the first one to say, hey, maybe we should look at implementing elements of all three. Let's take the best of these three different forms of government and figure out a way to protect ourselves against their downfalls. That idea kind of fizzled out and died, though, and didn't get really picked up and brought into the mainstream until the 1700s by a French guy named Baron Charles de Montesquieu. And he brought this idea of separate but coordinated powers into the mainstream. And this idea has widely been acknowledged as hugely influential in our founding. And the founding fathers certainly did grasp onto that. And they didn't implement it exactly the way he did. They took the concepts from Montesquieu, but made it their own. They built on it and did even more with it. So you have an executive branch that can make certain decisions very quickly. This is our commander in chief. So in times of war, we have a decisive leader that we can turn to help guide and bring us in safely. You have a Senate that represents the states. This is kind of the equivalent of the aristocracy. This is looking out for the interests of the entities that have a lot of the resources, the states. And then you have the House of Representatives, and this is the one that represents the people. This is kind of the equivalent of the democracy. And then they did throw in kind of a fourth quasi branch of government. The judicial branch was really just meant as a safeguard. The judicial branch didn't, at least, have the authority to act in any way on their own. The executive branch, the Senate, and the House of Representatives all had powers and things that they could act on proactively. The judicial branch was strictly reactive. They were the ones that, as things came through, they could determine whether some of the acts of those other branches were constitutional or not. And that was their sole function.